Last-minute shakeup at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning ride is okay.
And staying in front of the day isn't always
Nice
as simple
ride.
as 1,
What's
2,
up?
3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
What's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
You're listening to the NASM-CPT Podcast with Richey, winner of the Share Care Emmy Award for Social Storytelling and the official podcast of the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Hey y'all, and welcome to the NASM-CPT Podcast. My name is Richey, and today I'm digging into the mailbox because somebody asked me a question, and I feel like it's a question that used to get answered a lot, and maybe in my sister podcast, my friends over at the Master Instructor Roundtable, they answer this question a little bit more because they go into a little bit more about what's in the book and what's in the text. But I got this question and I want to answer it. And this is from Masoud_Zia on Instagram. He says, "Thanks for the great information on NASM. What's the best strategy for dealing with overactive muscles? Is it no strength training for them at all? Or do we strengthen the underactive muscles only and not the overactive muscles? And then is there also no stretching for the underactive muscles?" You can tell this is getting complicated. I don't really understand what's going on. When do we stretch and when do we strengthen? And I got to be honest, this is a great question. And I think NASM has probably muddied the waters with this a little bit because, conceptually, this is what you do. If a muscle is short, tight, and overactive, you got to stretch it. Short, tight, overactive, you stretch it. If it's lengthened or if it's weak, then you've got to strengthen that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if it's short, tight, and overactive, don't exercise it. And it doesn't mean that if a muscle is lengthened, that you don't stretch it. But there are caveats to all of this. And I think you got to ask these questions. And this is why I like the question so much, is a lot of times reading the text, it tells you short, tight, overactive, stretch, lengthened and weak, strengthen. And we generally leave it there because this is the problem that we are trying to solve. And it's a postural problem, or it is a movement dyskinesis problem. It is trying to get better patterns out of the way people move or the way that they squat or the way that they lift. But there are some things to unpack here. And so I think it's fair. So let me do this first of all. When it comes to those short, tight, overactive muscles, what do we already know that we do? Well, let's identify the NASM flexibility continuum. Let's go through that first. First of all, there are 3 different categories of flexibility. There is corrective flexibility, active flexibility, and functional flexibility. And our goal in life is not to have corrective flexibility or to have active flexibility. It is to have functional flexibility. And then we get there oftentimes through corrective and active. Then we can move into the functional category. So let's look at this. Corrective flexibility includes 2 different activities, 3 technically, but we don't teach one of them in the CPT. And it's self-myofascial rolling. That's number 1. And so if you're doing corrective, what does that mean? That means, let's say there's a muscle that's short, tight, overactive, and we need to correct a muscular imbalance. Foam rolling will be in the list of things that we would like to incorporate. So good, let's foam roll. And then the other one that we'll do is static stretching. So the static stretching, usually when you hear people talk about stretching, they are specifically talking about static stretching. Now, we need to be clear and use our language better because it's very important that we are addressing the right things as we speak. And so we could say stretch and we'll be talking about active stretching and somebody understands it as static. So we're just going to try to be clear. Usually stretch is static stretching. What is that? That is the holding the stretch for 30 seconds in order to increase length of a short, tight, overactive muscle. So short, tight, overactive muscle, you might include static stretching. Okay, well, are there times where you wouldn't include static stretching? I don't know. I mean, there probably are incidences where you could do that, but static stretching, the good news about static stretching and foam rolling is that they are not harmful. They're not harmful. So I don't stretch flexible people's hamstrings. But some people are like, can you stretch it? I like it. It makes me feel good. And I'm like, all right. Excuse me. So I might stretch their hamstrings, but in general, if their muscles aren't tight, then I don't stretch them. Why? Because static stretching is a corrective modality. So if I've got somebody, let's say they're a protracted shoulder girdle, and I might look at their pecs and their lats. So I'll go, okay, let's foam roll your pecs. Let's foam roll your lats. Let's static stretch your pecs. Let's static stretch your lats. Great. These are corrective strategies. So if I've got somebody who, let's say they can keep their knees straight and then they can do the front splits. They can keep one leg on the ground while standing, lift the other leg up until their knee touches their chin with their leg straight. Do those people need corrective flexibility? No. Well, not in their hamstrings anyway. And so I don't stretch that because I don't need to fix anything. I don't need to work towards correcting this pattern. Now, if they're hyper flexible like that, we may need to really focus on including a lot of strength training to ensure, especially around that capsule, that they stay stable. Now, active flexibility, this is like active isolated range of motion practicing where we use strength to push through a range of motion. So for instance, let's talk about tight hip flexors. Tight hip flexors, my hip flexors are tight, so I might do a kneeling hip flexor stretch. And instead of driving into that kneeling hip flexor stretch and doing posterior tilt and holding it for 30 seconds as a corrective strategy, I might just engage my glute to do a posterior tilt and go into hip extension in that same kneeling position and hold it for 1 to 2 seconds. Back out of it. Go into it again, hold for 1 to 2 seconds, back out, go back into it again. So I can do this active range of motion work. And let's say the corrective flexibility was giving length to my hip flexors. The active flexibility is encouraging that length while adding strength to the posterior muscle. The posterior muscle in this instance would be me doing glute exercises as I'm doing hip extension and a posterior pelvic tilt. And this builds strength through a range of motion. What's another way to build strength through a range of motion? Exercise. Then that's as part of the warm-up. You then move them into strength training. So you might do some kneeling hip flexor stretches, this active version, and then have them do bridges, weighted bridges, hip thrusts, things like that, where now you're really adding strength into a range of motion. And then, and you could also do self-myofascial rolling with that. And then functional flexibility is just the neuromuscular system's ability to produce and reduce and dynamically stabilize in multiple planes at various speeds in a safe and coordinated fashion. Could you say that again? Yes, but I ain't going to. I hit rewind. So I want to do functional flexibility. That is using my muscles to not only push through a range of motion, but to dynamically build momentum to get through a range of motion. Like leg swings are a great example of that, where I want to do a dynamic flexibility for my hamstrings, then I might do kicking into the air, like a straight leg kick. So leg swings, I can do it backwards for a hip flexor stretch. I might even do it backwards and let my knee bend, where I get an even more dynamic stretch for my rectus fem. Also, self-myofascial rolling are part of functional flexibility. So that's all my flexibility category. Now, if I'm doing those short, tight, overactive muscles, then why does it feel good when I stretch my weak, lengthened muscles sometimes? Well, I'll tell you in just a moment. Because this episode of the NASM-CPT Podcast is brought to you by NASM One, the membership for trainers and coaches. Members enjoy unlimited access to hundreds of career resources. Get the Edge app to schedule and program clients, enjoy half off all certifications and specializations, access free CEUs, and more. All of this for just $35 a month. Go to nasm.org/membership to learn more about NASM One. Well, Rick, my shoulder blades, I'm in protracted position, slightly elevated. So I find that when I protract more and I stretch those muscles that are already lengthened and overactive, I stretch them, and then I go back, then it feels good in between my shoulder blades. Yeah, so this is where we pick up the feelings aren't fact category here. So yes, does it feel better? I'm sure it does, but that is a neurological response, not an actual address of the problem. The neurological response is I've got a muscle that's lengthened and active. So I lengthen it more and I get that to neurologically calm down. It still goes through the process of autogenic inhibition. And then it gets neurologically tight again. Why is it tight? Well, probably because you're protracted and you're stuck in this position and it wants you back here. It's pulling and it is in this lengthened position and it's grabbing, trying to get back to a neutral, to more appropriate length tension relationship. And it's finding that hard. And so what would be better, even though you stretch it and it feels better, is to strengthen it. And here's the thing. When you start strengthening those mid traps and the rhomboids and the lower traps, and you start working on the retraction and decelerating protraction and trying to stabilize in a neutral position, those muscles are going to get sore. And they're going to get sore more quickly than other muscles, probably because you're not working them very much into that range of motion. And then when they're sore, oh my goodness, it's like walking around staying protracted. Why does it feel this way? This over protraction position is a stretch. And I feel like I shouldn't be in here, but it feels good to do. Oh, it's because you're stretching some short, tight, or some sore muscles that you've been strengthening. Is it good to strengthen those muscles? Yeah, that's what you should be doing. Prioritize strengthening those muscles far more than you would prioritize building additional length to a muscle that already has length. There's nothing to correct there, so there shouldn't be anything to statically stretch there. Well, there's more to talk about in this, and let's go to the hip flexors again as an example, because a lot of times you see people in an anterior pelvic tilt, and they might have tight hamstrings, and then you look at them, you go, oh, they look like they have tight hamstring. Well, they look like they have short, overactive, tight hip flexors, but when I do the range of motion test, they also have tight hamstrings. So we can do a range of motion test and see, oh, do they have tight hamstrings? Got it. Do they have tight hip flexors? Yes, got it. So which one do we prioritize? Well, prioritize the one that is leading the path to dysfunction. So if tight hamstrings isn't causing a posterior tilt, which it should be if they were short, tight, and overactive, but the hip flexors do an anterior pelvic tilt, and that's the one leading to the visual compensation, then I would say focus on building strength in, lengthening the hip flexors. Got to stretch out the hip flexors. Well, does that mean don't stretch the hamstrings? Well, I don't think so, actually. But your priority here is likely not that the hamstrings are tight because you're in a posterior tilt and it's causing dysfunction. The hamstrings are likely tight because the anterior tilt, much like the protraction in the shoulder girdle, is causing a stretch in the hamstring outside of a pattern that it doesn't want to be in. And it's trying to grab the pelvis and pull it back into a neutral position. But it is also likely that the hip flexors are tight, leading to reciprocal inhibition, causing the glutes to not be activating the way that they need to. And if the glutes aren't working the way that they need to, then the synergist for the glutes and hip extension are going to be the hamstrings, and the hamstrings are taking over for potentially what the glutes should be doing. Now, this is an elaborate scheme. But there's a lot of truth to it and a lot of potential for that to be the case. I'm not saying it's the case in every one of them, but I guarantee this: if you strengthen the glutes and you don't stretch the hip flexors or the hamstrings, you do glute strengthening exercise, and then you retest the hip flexors and you retest the hamstrings, I guarantee you'll increase some range of motion. Now, if you want to increase range of motion more, what do? Static stretch them. You can foam roll them, yes. But does that mean don't strengthen them? No. In fact, it doesn't. And this is where I divert with a lot of colleagues here is I don't believe so. In fact, if you watch somebody do a squat assessment and you see a lot of anterior pelvic tilt, and then you really pinpoint it down, you go, this is a lot of hip flexor because I do my heel raise, I do my arms down. You're going to do all your variations with your overhead squat assessment, and you really do identify hip flexors are tight. And then you can do like a Thomas test or some type of scanning test, and you can identify them more specifically. Are the hip flexors tight? And yes, they are tight. But if you did a strength test to them, majority of people have short, tight, overactive, weak hip flexors. Wait, they're short and they're tight and they're overactive and they're weak? Yes, and the reason they're weak is not because they're too strong. The reason you're weak is because of positional shortening. You sit in a seated position a lot of the day. You go to work, you sit down, and you're in a hip flex position. You get out of work, you go back to the car, you sit down in the car, you go back home. You're tired from a long day at work, so you have a seat, and at the end of the day, you get into bed and crawl up into the fetal position. You are hip flexed. You a hip flex fool. What do we do? Well, I like the idea of stretching them, but does that mean that they're too strong? No, that just means they're too short. So stretch them, yes, but don't strengthen them. No, I didn't say that. If they're weak, you strengthen them. I also am a big fan of if they're strong, keep strengthening them. But you want to provide balance to the force. Where should my primary focus be? Well, in my glutes, but it doesn't mean don't strengthen my hamstring. Where's my primary focus in my range of motion? Well, I can stretch the hamstrings. Does that mean I can't lengthen the hamstring? That I can't shorten the hamstrings, make them stronger? No, it doesn't mean that at all. But what if my hamstrings are short, tight, and overactive? Don't do deadlifts? No, in fact, doing things like RDLs can help to lengthen your hamstrings and strengthen your hamstrings. So when it comes to stretching, stretch the muscles that are short, tight, and overactive. When it comes to strengthening, strengthen every one of the muscles. Strengthen all your muscles. But strengthen the opposing muscles when it comes to movement dysfunction more. You're trying to create balance in your programming. So if I'm very protracted in my shoulder girdle, you can still do chest. You can still do a chest day. But maybe when you are doing your opposing muscle group, and the opposing muscle group is an opposing movement. So if I'm in the horizontal plane doing a barbell chest press, I need to be in a horizontal plane doing a rear delt or a high row. And I also need to focus on that retraction, that pulling movement, maybe more than the pushing movement. That's going to develop balance. But what we don't do is say, hey, I'm tight in my chest, so we're going to stretch them, foam roll them and stretch them and not exercise them. That's not how it works. We don't do that. Well, I want every muscle to be strengthened, but I want you to create that strengthening via a program of exercise selection that helps to prioritize balance when it comes to your movement patterns. So I might do my series of foam rolling and stretching for my pecs and my lats for that protracted shoulder girdle. And then I might do a couple of strengthening exercises like rear delt flies, where I'm focusing on retracting my shoulder blades and I'm focusing on a horizontal abduction. And I'm just doing that movement prep, that series before you even start to work out, can help to provide a more balanced position in your body before you even start lifting. So then you can say, okay, I'm going to do bench press because I like doing bench press, but let's do 3 sets of that. But let's do 4 sets of a high row or a horizontal row where I'm again counterbalancing the position of my barbell bench press, and I'm trying to maintain balance of muscle activation. Does that mean don't exercise muscles that are short, tight, overactive? I don't fall into that camp. I do not fall into that category. Exercise your muscles. I also like stretching. There are a lot of strength coaches. There are a lot of people that don't advocate stretching because you can get stretch through strengthening. What do you mean? Well, I can get stretched through a deep dumbbell chest press, and it stretches my pecs when I go down, and then I lift, and every time I come back down at that dumbbell chest pec stretch or dumbbell chest press, my pecs get stretched. Same thing with pull-ups or a lat pull down, especially a narrow grip lat pull down. As it pulls me up, it's stretching my lats. And then I pull the weight down and I'm shortening. So I'm building increased range of motion through just doing strength training exercises. Does that mean you don't need to stretch? I would say that the weights are definitely stretching you, but if you're looking at corrective strategies, I would say foam roll, stretch, and then do exercises that pull you into a stretched position, but do the exercises for the muscles that are considered tight. But do them in a big range of motion where you're working through or into a stretched position as you do your movement. All right, y'all. Thanks for listening. Like, subscribe, share with your fitness friends and family. And if you've got questions for me like Masood did, then you can hit me up on Instagram at dr.rickrichey, or you can email me, rick.richey@nasm.org. Y'all keep inspiring people to fitness. Thanks for listening. This has been the NASM-CPT Podcast.